My daughter-in-law rudely said, "Don't expect a penny of your son's 30 million." Her voice rang with contempt, as if I were a pathetic beggar rather than a father. But during the reading of the will, she suddenly turned pale when the lawyer read my name. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The wrench slipped from my oil-stained fingers the moment I heard that doctor's voice. Metal hit concrete with a sharp clatter that echoed through my garage like a gunshot. "Mr. Fox, I'm afraid I have tragic news about your son Chad. He suffered a massive heart attack this morning at his office." The words bounced around my skull without finding purchase. Chad, heart attack, my boy was only 42. I slid down the garage wall until I hit the floor, the concrete cold against my back through my work shirt. "Sir, are you still there?" "I'm here." My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "When did this happen?" "Around 11 this morning. He was found at his desk by his secretary. The paramedics did everything they could, but he was already gone." Already gone. The phrase twisted in my chest like a knife. I stared at the underside of my old Ford pickup, oil stains mapping out years of repairs. 36 years I'd spent under hoods like this one, fixing things that were broken. But I couldn't fix this. "Mr. Fox, we'll need someone to make arrangements. Is there family we should contact?" "His wife, Joyce." The name tasted bitter. I'll call her." After hanging up, I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The afternoon heat pressed through the open garage door, carrying the scent of Texas dust and motor oil. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but nothing would ever be the same again. I pulled myself up on shaking legs and walked to my workbench. There, next to a coffee can full of screws, sat a framed photo of 8-year-old Chad holding a base he'd caught at Lake Meredith. His gap-toothed grin could have powered the whole garage. That boy had been so proud of that fish, barely bigger than his hand. My phone felt heavy as I dialed Joyce's number. It went straight to voicemail. "You've reached Joyce Fox. I'm unable to take your call right now, but please leave a detailed message, and I'll return it at my earliest convenience." Even her voicemail sounded cold, professional, like talking to a machine instead of family. "Joyce, it's Otis. I just heard about Chad. Please call me back as soon as you get this. We need to talk about arrangements." I tried again 20 minutes later. Same result. Then again an hour after that. By the 6th attempt, my hands were shaking with something that felt like anger, mixed with desperation. "Joyce, this is the 6th time I've called. I know you're there. I know we don't get along, but this isn't about us anymore. Please, just call me back." I threw the phone against the garage wall. It bounced off and clattered across the floor, battery cover popping off. The silence that followed felt enormous, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The photo of Chad stared back at me from the workbench. In it, he was still my little boy, before business school, before California, before Joyce, before the distance that had grown between us like weeds in a garden nobody tended. I picked up the pieces of my phone and snapped it back together. The screen had a crack running through it now, but it still worked, just like everything else in my life, damaged but functional. The decision formed slowly, the way rust creeps across metal. I couldn't sit here in this garage waiting for Joyce to decide I was worth calling back. Chad was my son, my only child. Margaret and I had waited so long for him, had been so grateful when he finally came. I pulled my old canvas duffel bag from the closet and started packing. 3 changes of clothes, my shaving kit, the photo of Chad. My hands moved automatically while my mind tried to process what my life looked like now. No more Sunday phone calls where Chad would tell me about his latest real estate deal in that excited voice that reminded me of the boy who'd caught that base. No more Christmas cards with pictures of him standing in front of increasingly expensive houses. The drive to Los Angeles would take 12 hours if I pushed it. I'd driven it once before when Chad graduated from business school. That was back when Joyce still pretended to tolerate me, back before she decided I wasn't good enough for their new life. I folded Chad's photo carefully between 2 shirts. The glass had a small crack in one corner, where I'd dropped the frame years ago. I'd never bothered to fix it. Now I wished I had. Outside, the sun was starting to set. painting my garage in long shadows. Tomorrow I'd lock up this place and drive west, toward a son I'd never see again and a daughter-in-law who wished I'd never existed. But tonight I sat on my workbench and cried for the little boy who'd been so proud of that fish. The truck door slammed shut as the first hint of sunrise painted the Texas sky pink. I'd spent the night packing and repacking, trying to keep my hands busy while my mind spun in circles. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, peered through her kitchen window as I loaded the last of my things, her face creased with concern. I gave her a wave but didn't stop to explain. How do you tell someone your whole world just collapsed? The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility I didn't want. Interstate 40 would take me through New Mexico, Arizona, and finally into California. 12 hours of driving with nothing but my thoughts and the ghosts of conversations I'd never have with Chad again. Miles clicked by in a blur of desert landscape. The radio offered morning traffic reports and weather updates for a world that kept spinning despite everything. I reached for the dial, then pulled my hand back. Silence felt more honest somehow. Somewhere outside Albuquerque, a memory ambushed me. Chad, at 8 years old, standing in our backyard with a baseball glove too big for his hands. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind us, humming something I couldn't remember now. "Dad, when will I be as big as you?" Chad had asked, squinting up at me in the afternoon light. "Hold the ball with both hands, son. You'll get there." I'd knelt down to his level, adjusting his grip. "Just remember to keep your eye on the ball, no matter how fast it comes at you." He'd nodded with the seriousness kids bring to everything they think matters. We must have spent an hour out there, tossing that ball back and forth while Margaret's sheets danced in the breeze like white flags of surrender. The memory hit me so hard I had to pull over at a rest stop. I sat in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel while tears blurred my vision. When had we stopped playing catch? When had he gotten too busy for his old man? "Long drive ahead, Grandpa?" The gas station attendant couldn't have been more than 20, with kind eyes that reminded me of Chad at that age. "Going to see my son." The words came out before I could stop them. "Though I guess I'm too late for that." The kid's expression shifted, understanding without needing details. "Sorry for your loss, sir. Drive safe." Back on the highway, another memory found me. Chad at 25, calling to tell me about his first big real estate deal. His voice had been electric with excitement, the way it used to get when he'd mastered a new baseball pitch. "Dad, I just closed my biggest deal yet. Buy a $2 million property in Beverly Hills." I'd been in this same garage, elbow deep in some neighbor's transmission. "That's more money than I'll see in a lifetime, boy. Maybe you should come visit, see what I've built out here." But I never had. There was always another car to fix, another excuse to stay in Texas where things made sense, where I didn't have to pretend to understand wine menus or worry about saying the wrong thing to Joyce's fancy friends. The landscape changed as I drove west. Texas plains gave way to New Mexico desert, then Arizona mountains. Each mile took me further from the life I knew and closer to a world where my son had lived and died without me really knowing who he'd become. By evening, Los Angeles sprawled before me like a circuit board made of lights. The freeway signs pointed toward Beverly Hills, toward addresses that existed in a different universe from my garage in Amarillo. My truck felt smaller somehow, dwarfed by the luxury cars flowing around us like schools of expensive fish. Chad's neighborhood was a maze of perfect lawns and houses that looked more like museums than homes. Each driveway held cars worth more than I'd made in the past 5 years. Palm trees lined the streets like sentries, their fronds rustling in a breeze that smelled of money and secrets. I found the address and pulled up to gates that looked like they belonged on a castle. Through the iron bars I could see a mansion that would have fit 3 of my house inside it, with room to spare. This was where my son had lived. This was the world he'd chosen over Sunday dinners and baseball in the backyard. The truck engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in this perfect silence. I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. D-work shirt wrinkled from the drive, stubble from a sleepless night, eyes red-rimmed with grief and exhaustion. Not exactly the image of a Beverly Hills father-in-law, but I was here. After 12 hours of memories and regrets, I was finally here. I took a deep breath, tasting the unfamiliar air of my son's chosen home and reached for the door handle. The electronic gate buzzed like an angry wasp as I approached the intercom. Marble columns flanked the entrance, each one probably worth more than my annual Social Security check. Through the bars, I could see a circular driveway with a fountain at its center, water dancing in the golden evening light. I pressed the button and waited. Somewhere inside that palace, Joyce was deciding whether I was worth her time. "What do you want?" Her voice crackled through the speaker, sharp enough to cut glass. "Joyce, it's Otis. I drove out from Texas. We need to talk about Chad." Silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could picture her standing in whatever room she used as a command center, calculating whether acknowledging my existence was worth the trouble. "What are you doing here, Otis?" "I came because of Chad. We need to discuss funeral arrangements. I can handle everything myself. You should go back to Texas." The gate stayed closed. Behind it, automatic lights were beginning to illuminate the landscape, turning the mansion into something from a fairy tale, or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. "I know we don't get along, but this isn't the time for that." I kept my voice steady, the way I would when dealing with a customer who thought I was trying to cheat them. "He was my son, too." Another long pause. Then the gate began to swing open with mechanical precision. "Fine, but wipe your boots before you come in." I parked my dusty truck next to a Mercedes that probably cost more than my house. The contrast was almost comical, D like a mutt at a dog show. I removed my baseball cap and ran a hand through my gray hair, trying to look presentable for whatever ordeal waited inside. Joyce met me at the front door, and I had to admit she looked good for a woman who'd just lost her husband. Designer black dress that probably had a French name, makeup applied with professional precision, not a hair out of place. She looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting. "It's been a long day." She turned and walked into the house without another word, her heels clicking on marble floors that stretched toward a ceiling high enough to host a circus. I followed, trying not to gawk at the crystal chandeliers and artwork that belonged in museums. Everything was white and gold and perfect, like a hotel lobby designed to intimidate. "Sit!" She gestured toward a living room the size of my entire house. The furniture looked like it had never been used, arranged around a coffee table made from what appeared to be a single slab of marble. I settled onto a couch that was probably worth more than my truck, my work boots looking ridiculous against Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. Joyce remained standing, maintaining the high ground both literally and figuratively. "I've already started making arrangements," she said, her tone suggesting I was an unwelcome interruption. "The funeral home, the service, everything. It's all under control." "What about the burial?" Chad never told me what he wanted. "He'll be cremated. It's more practical." She said it like she was discussing garbage pickup. "There's really nothing for you to do here, Otis. I appreciate you coming, but I can handle everything myself." I looked around the room, taking in the view through floor-to-ceiling windows that showed a backyard with a tennis court and swimming pool. This was the life my son had built, the world he'd chosen. It was impressive, I had to admit. It was also cold as a morgue. "When's the service?" "Friday. Very small, very private. Just a few close friends." The message was clear. You're not invited. But I'd driven 12 hours and wasn't about to be dismissed like a door-to-door salesman. "Joyce, I'm not asking for much. I just want to say goodbye to my boy." For the first time since I'd arrived, something flickered in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but maybe recognition that she was dealing with another human being instead of an inconvenience. "All right. Friday at 2 o'clock. Sunset Memorial Chapel, on Wilshire Boulevard." She sat down across from me, perched on the edge of her chair like she might need to escape quickly. But this doesn't change anything between us. I never expected it to. We sat there for a moment in expensive silence. Through the windows I could see lights beginning to twinkle across the city below. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, worrying about normal problems. I envied them. "I should find a motel," I said, standing up. "I'll come by tomorrow if there's anything that needs discussing." Joyce walked me to the door, maintaining her distance like I might be contagious. At the threshold, she paused. "You know, Otis, Chad left quite an estate. I'll be taking care of all his business interests, of course, There's a lot to manage." The way she said it made it sound like a warning, like she was establishing territory, marking boundaries I shouldn't cross. I nodded and walked back to my truck, feeling her eyes on me until I was through the gate. Driving away from that mansion, I caught a glimpse of it in my rearview mirror, all lit up like a cruise ship in the darkness. My son had lived there, had walked those marble floors and looked out those windows. He'd built this life, this fortune, this perfect world, and somehow, in all of it, there hadn't been room for his old man. The marble floor felt cold beneath my worn boots as Joyce led me deeper into Chad's world. Each step echoed in the cavernous hallway, bouncing off walls lined with artwork that probably cost more than my house. She moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything she touched, her heels clicking like a countdown to something inevitable. "This was Chad's office," she said, pushing open heavy oak doors. "He spent most of his time here toward the end." The room took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city lights, and every surface gleamed with success I'd never witnessed firsthand. Business awards lined the shelves. Photos showed Chad shaking hands with people in expensive suits, and a massive desk dominated the center like an altar to achievement. Joyce picked up a crystal frame containing a photo of Chad at some charity gala, both of them in formal wear that cost more than my truck. He loved these events. We were quite the power couple. I studied the photo. Chad looked different than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, older somehow, though he was smiling for the camera. He never mentioned these parties. Chad didn't talk much about his social life with... She paused, letting the sentence hang like a blade. "Well, he was very busy." Moving to his desk, she began pulling out papers and appointment books. "We need to finalize the arrangements. The funeral home needs decisions tonight." "What about burial?" "Margaret's buried at Rose Hill Cemetery back home. Chad used to visit her grave when he was young." Joyce's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Chad always wanted cremation, not burial. He told me many times." "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "He told me he wanted to be next to his mother at the cemetery." "You don't know what he wanted these past few years, Otis." Heat rose in my chest. "Maybe not. But I knew him for 42 years, and you've known him for 2. Her smile could have frozen water. 2 years as his wife. That counts more than decades as a distant father. The words hit like physical blows. I gripped the edge of Chad's desk, feeling the smooth wood beneath my calloused fingers. Every trophy, every award, every symbol of success stared down at me like judges finding me wanting. "Look at this." Joyce held up Chad's phone, scrolling through contacts. Business partners, investors, country club friends, 200 names of people who mattered to him now. She moved through the list dismissively, deleting names she deemed unworthy. "This person hasn't seen Chad in months. This one's just a golf acquaintance. We'll keep the service small, elegant." I watched her reduce my son's relationships to checkmarks on her private list. Each deleted name felt like another piece of Chad disappearing, another connection severed by her judgment. What about his college friends, the guys he grew up with? Those people don't fit the image we're presenting. Image, not memory, not love, not respect for the dead. Image. Joyce made calls to funeral directors while I sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her conversations were crisp, professional, focused on logistics rather than grief. She discussed flowers like ordering groceries, selected music like choosing wallpaper. "The viewing will be Thursday evening, service Friday afternoon," she announced, hanging up. "Everything's arranged. Can I contribute anything? Help with costs?" Another of those ice-cold laughs. "Otis, this funeral will cost more than you make in 2 years. Don't worry about money. I'll be taking care of all Chad's financial matters from now on." The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was already spending money that hadn't even been legally transferred yet. We settled the details through gritted teeth and false politeness. Cremation instead of burial, expensive flowers instead of simple arrangements. A guest list scrubbed clean of anyone who might remember the boy Chad used to be. As we finished, Joyce walked me to the front door with the satisfaction of someone who'd won every round. "I'll handle the financial discussions with the lawyers after we get through this sad business. There's quite a lot to manage, but don't worry. I'll take care of everything." Standing at the threshold, I looked back one more time at the mansion that had been my son's home. Somewhere in all that marble and crystal and success, There should have been traces of the boy who'd caught that base, who'd thrown that baseball, who'd called me Dad. But all I could see was Joyce's reflection in the polished surfaces, multiplied endlessly like a hall of mirrors, showing the same cold smile. The door closed behind me with a sound like a vault ceiling shut. The neon sign of Desert Inn Motel flickered like a dying heartbeat as I pulled my truck into the cracked parking lot. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time, paint peeling from concrete walls, weeds pushing through asphalt, a far cry from the marble palace I'd just left. But the price was right for my pension, and nobody here would judge me for my dusty boots. Room 12 smelled of old cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. The bedspread looked like it hadn't been changed since the 80s, and the air conditioner wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, feeling springs sag under my weight. From my wallet, I pulled out 2 photos. Margaret, at 25, radiant in her wedding dress, standing next to a young man who still had all his hair and hope in his eyes. Next to it, Chad at his own wedding 2 years ago, smiling nervously while Joyce posed like she was on a magazine cover. That wedding. I should have known then what kind of woman she was. The memories surfaced like oil on water, dark and unavoidable. Spring afternoon in Beverly Hills, expensive white chairs arranged on manicured grass. I'd worn my only suit, the same one I'd buried Margaret in, and felt every thread of its cheapness among Chad's new friends. "You sure about this, Joyce, son?" I'd asked, during a quiet moment. Chad had been adjusting his tie, nervous energy radiating off him like heat. "Dad, I'm happy for the first time since the divorce. She makes me feel young again." Across the lawn, Joyce had been posing for photos with her model friends, all legs and perfect teeth and calculated beauty. One of them had whispered something, and they'd both looked my way. "Look at his father," Joyce's friend had said, just loud enough for me to hear. "Chad's embarrassed by him." Joyce had laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. What can you expect? Different worlds entirely. I'd seen how she looked at my worn suit, my calloused hands, the way I held my champagne glass like it might break. To her, I was a relic from Chad's past that couldn't be thrown away, but certainly could be hidden. The motel phone rang, startling me from the memory. Nobody had this number except... I checked the clock. Past midnight. "Otis, what happened, friend? It's past midnight here." Harlan's voice cut through the silence like a lifeline. "Chad's gone, Harlan. Heart attack. And his wife, she's nothing like our Margaret was. I'm sorry, old buddy. How are you holding up?" I stared at the water stains on the ceiling, trying to find words for feelings. I didn't understand myself. She treats me like I'm dirt under her designer shoes. Makes me feel like an intruder at my own son's funeral. That woman's got no class, no matter how much money she's got. The worst part is, I think Chad knew. These past few years he sounded different on the phone. Distant, like he was apologizing for something he couldn't say. Harlan's breathing was steady on the other end, the sound of a friend letting silence do the talking when words weren't enough. "You need me to come out there?" he asked finally. "No, this is something I have to face alone. But Harlan, what if I failed him? What if I let that woman turn him against everything we taught him? Otis Fox, you listen to me. You raised a good boy who turned into a successful man. Don't let some gold digger make you question 42 years of being a father." After hanging up, I lay in the darkness listening to traffic on the freeway, the city humming like a machine that never slept. In a few hours I'd have to get up and face Joyce again, play nice for Chad's funeral, pretend we were family instead of strangers connected by grief and genetics. Margaret's photo caught the streetlight from the window. If she were here, she'd know what to say to Joyce, how to handle this situation with grace instead of stumbling through it like I was doing. Margaret had possessed a quiet strength that could shame devils into behaving like angels. But Margaret was gone, and Chad was gone, and I was alone in a cheap motel room trying to figure out how to bury my son with dignity, while his widow treated me like hired help. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, all I could do was hold on to Margaret's memory and hope it would give me strength for whatever Joyce had planned next. The alarm clock glowed 12:47 a.m. as I finally closed my eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Eternal Rest Funeral Home as I straightened my only black tie in the truck's rearview mirror. Thursday had passed in a blur of picking up a decent suit from a thrift store and avoiding phone calls from Joyce about last-minute details. Now Friday had arrived with the weight of finality I wasn't ready to bear. Inside the funeral home, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and whispered conversations. Joyce held court near the front entrance, surrounded by women in designer black and men in $1,000 suits. She'd transformed grief into a social occasion, complete with air kisses and meaningful glances. I signed the guest book with a pen that probably cost more than my daily grocery budget, and took a seat in the back rows. From there, I could watch the theater unfold without becoming part of the performance. "Such a tragedy," one woman was saying to Joyce, "and so young." Joyce dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her makeup expertly applied to suggest tears without actually running. Chad worked so hard, his heart just couldn't take the stress. A businessman in an Italian suit approached with condolences. "Joyce, if there's anything you need help managing Chad's portfolio, his properties—" "You're so kind, Robert. I'll be handling everything personally, of course." Everything personally. Like Chad's life was a business she'd inherited along with his death. I watched her work the room, accepting sympathy like tribute. Each conversation a careful balance of performed grief and strategic networking. These people barely knew Chad as anything more than a name on contracts and charity event guest lists. Then I heard her voice drop to that conspiratorial whisper she thought was private. "Look at that old man over there," she murmured to a blonde woman who'd been hanging on her every word. Chad was so ashamed of him. The woman Lisa, I think her name was Dee, glanced my way with unconcealed pity. "Joyce, surely he's grieving too. He barely visited. Now he wants to play loving father." Joyce's laugh was soft venom. Chad told me his father never understood his success, always made him feel guilty for improving his life. The words hit like slaps across the face. Whatever distance had grown between Chad and me, I'd never made him feel ashamed of what he'd accomplished. If anything, I'd been proud, maybe too proud to tell him often enough. I stood up, my chair creaking in the funeral home silence. Joyce's conversation stopped as I approached their little circle of gossip and designer grief. "Joyce, this is inappropriate. Today we're burying my son." Her expression shifted like a mask being adjusted, suddenly all wounded dignity. "Of course, Otis. I'm just emotional. You understand. We all grieve differently." Lisa looked uncomfortable, realizing she'd been caught participating in something ugly. Other conversations around us had stopped, waiting to see if family drama would erupt at a funeral. "Perhaps we should focus on Chad today," I said quietly. "Not on our differences." Joyce nodded with fake solemnity, but her eyes promised retribution for my public correction. "You're absolutely right. Families should support each other in times like these." The minister called everyone to be seated for the service. I returned to my back row perch, while Joyce took her place in the front, surrounded by supporters who would forget Chad's name within a month. Chad Fox was a man who valued family above all else, the minister began, clearly working from notes Joyce had provided. He built not just a business empire, but lasting relationships. I stared at the casket, thinking about the boy who'd been so excited about that fish, who'd asked when he'd be as big as his dad. Somewhere between that backyard catch and this marble funeral home, I'd lost my son to a world that measured worth in zeros on bank statements. The service proceeded with hymns Chad never sang and readings from books he'd never opened. Joyce's performance peaked during the eulogy, her sobs perfectly timed for maximum effect. When people filed past the casket to pay respects, I waited until last. Standing there alone with Chad's closed casket, I whispered the things I should have said years ago, about being proud of him, about loving him despite our differences, about wishing I'd fought harder to stay part of his life, instead of letting Joyce's subtle hostility push me away. Outside, the funeral procession prepared to move to the cemetery. Joyce, surrounded by her supporters, was already discussing handling the legal matters after this sad business with someone who looked like a lawyer. I climbed into my truck to follow the procession, catching a glimpse of Joyce in her limousine through the window. She was checking her makeup in a compact mirror, already moving past grief toward whatever came next. Something cold settled in my stomach as I started the engine. Joyce was too confident, too eager to discuss Chad's financial affairs, like she already knew exactly what those affairs contained. The mahogany conference table in Cecil Grant's office felt as cold as the cemetery ground we'd just left behind. 42 floors above downtown LA, the late afternoon sun filtered through tinted windows, casting everything in a golden hue that somehow made the formal setting feel even more removed from reality. Joyce had ridden in the black limousine with her supporters, while I'd followed in my pickup, feeling like a funeral crasher at my own son's final ceremony. Now she sat at the head of the polished table, like she was chairing a board meeting, her designer black dress perfectly arranged, not a hair out of place despite the emotional day. Cecil Grant looked every inch the successful attorney, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of calm confidence that came from decades of handling family crises. His office walls were lined with law books and diplomas that probably cost more than my annual income just to frame. "Thank you all for coming," Cecil began, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd conducted hundreds of these readings. "I know this has been a difficult day." Joy smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the window behind her. Even in grief, she was performing, making sure every angle was perfect for whatever audience she imagined was watching. "Otis, you don't need to stay," she said, not bothering to look at me directly. "Don't expect a single penny from my husband's $30 million anyway." The dismissal hit like a slap, but I'd grown used to her casual cruelty. I started to stand, my baseball cap clutched in weathered hands, when something made me pause. "I just want to hear Chad's final wishes." "Chad's final wish was to provide for me. That's a wife's right." She cut me off with the authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "This is really just a formality." Lisa, the blonde friend who'd been hanging on Joyce's every word at the funeral, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even Tyler, Chad's cousin from back east, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Cecil arranged several legal documents on the table, each one bound with ribbon and bearing official seals. The afternoon light caught the gold embossing on the covers, making them look more like medieval scrolls than modern paperwork. "Please, everyone take your seats," Cecil said diplomatically. "Let's begin the reading." Joyce leaned over to whisper something to Lisa, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "This is just a formality. Chad told me he'd taken care of everything." I settled back into my leather chair, the expensive material creaking under my weight. Everything in this office screamed money and power the kind of world Chad had built for himself, the kind of place where his old man had no business being. Mark, one of Chad's business partners, adjusted his tie nervously. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Cecil opened the first document, the paper crackling with the weight of legal authority. Joyce's confidence filled the room like expensive perfume. She sat straight-backed, hands folded, the picture of dignified grief mixed with anticipation. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of 2 years as Chad's wife, the reward for enduring his occasionally difficult family. From where I sat, I could see the city stretching out below us through the massive windows. Somewhere down there was the garage where I used to teach Chad about engines, the cemetery where Margaret was buried, the motel where I'd spent last night, wondering how I'd failed as a father. Cecil cleared his throat formally, adjusting his reading glasses as he prepared to begin. The late afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the polished conference table. The last will and testament of Chad Michael Fox, dated January 15th, 2025. Joyce leaned forward expectantly, her eyes bright with anticipation. I sat back in my chair, resigned to hearing how thoroughly I'd been written out of my son's final chapter. Cecil's voice carried across the silent conference room as he read the formal, legal language that always preceded life-changing news. The afternoon light had shifted, casting sharp shadows across faces that would never look the same after the next few minutes. "After careful consideration of my assets and relationships," Cecil continued, his professional tone giving no hint of the earthquake about to hit, "I make the following bequests." Joyce's fingers drummed silently against the leather armrest, her wedding ring catching the light. She'd positioned herself like a queen receiving tribute, certain that each word would confirm her expectations. To my cousin Tyler Fox, I leave my collection of vintage wines, valued at approximately $15,000. Cecil paused while Tyler nodded gratefully. To my business partner, Mark Stevens, I leave my shares in the Riverside Development Project, valued at approximately $100,000. Standard small bequests. Joyce's smile grew more confident with each minor gift to others, seeing them as proof that the real inheritance D, the millions D, would be hers alone. Cecil turned to the next page, and something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His voice remained steady, but I caught him glancing at Joyce with what might have been sympathy. To my beloved father, Otis Fox, I leave the majority of my estate, including all business interests, stock portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $29 million. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Joyce's face drained of color so fast I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out initially. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cecil continued reading as if he hadn't heard her, his professional training keeping him focused on the legal requirements. To my wife, Joyce Fox, I leave the Santa Monica condominium, valued at approximately $800,000, along with all furnishings and personal effects contained therein. Joyce's hand flew to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The confident woman who dismissed me minutes earlier looked like she'd been physically struck. "Chad, why would you—" I heard myself saying, though the words felt disconnected from my thoughts. $29 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. "This can't be right," Joyce's voice cracked as she leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "Check the documents again." Others around the table exchanged shocked glances. Tyler's mouth hung open. Mark looked like he was calculating something in his head. Lisa stared at Joyce with obvious concern for her friend's mental state. Cecil maintained his professional composure, though I could see the strain in his shoulders. "The will was properly executed and witnessed, Mrs. Fox. These are Chad's legal wishes." Joyce began to tremble, her carefully constructed facade cracking like ice in spring. The woman who'd spent the day playing the grieving widow was being confronted with the reality that her husband had chosen his estranged father over her. My own hands were shaking as the implications hit me. $29 million. More money than I could comprehend, let alone manage. Why had Chad done this? We'd grown apart over the years, barely talked, except for stilted holiday phone calls. "There has to be some mistake," Joyce said again, but her voice carried less conviction now. The legal documents scattered across Cecil's desk were official, stamped, impossible to argue with. Cecil folded his hands on the table, waiting for the shock to settle before continuing with any additional provisions. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone processed what they'd just heard. Joyce stared at the legal documents, like they were written in a foreign language, her mind clearly struggling to accept what had just happened to her expected future. The confidence that had carried her through the day had evaporated completely. I looked at my calloused hands resting on the expensive conference table, trying to understand what my son had been thinking when he made these decisions. Somewhere in the distance, traffic hummed 42 floors below, the normal world continuing while ours had just been turned upside down. The silence shattered like expensive crystal when Joyce finally found her voice, rising from her chair with the fury of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. "This is fraud!" Her shout echoed off the office walls, making everyone jump. "That old man manipulated Chad when he was sick." I remained seated, trying to process both the inheritance and Joyce's explosive reaction. "Joyce, I didn't even know about the will." "Liar!" She pointed an accusatory finger at me, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "You always resented me, always poisoned Chad against me." Cecil stood up, his professional calm finally showing strain. "Mrs. Fox, this will was prepared according to all legal requirements. There was no coercion or manipulation involved." Joyce swept her arm across the conference table, sending legal documents scattering across the polished floor like expensive confetti. "I was his wife. I loved him. I took care of him. I was building a life with him." Tyler and Mark pushed back from the table, clearly wanting to escape the family warfare erupting in front of them. Lisa sat frozen, watching her friend's complete breakdown with horrified fascination. You think you can just waltz in here and steal my inheritance? Joyce's voice was getting higher, more shrill with each accusation. I know what you did. You manipulated a sick man who felt guilty about being a terrible father. The words stung because they carried enough truth to hurt. I had been distant. I had let work and small-town life keep me from Chad's world. But manipulation? I'd barely seen him these past 2 years. Joyce, please, I started, but she cut me off with another wave of fury. Don't you dare, Joyce, please me. She grabbed her designer purse like a weapon, clutching it against her chest. I sacrificed everything for Chad. I gave up my modeling career. I moved to this city. I played the perfect wife to his business associates. Cecil was gathering the scattered documents from the floor, trying to restore some semblance of professional order to the chaos. Mrs. Fox, if you wish to contest the will, that's your legal right. But this outburst isn't helping anyone. Contest it? Joyce laughed, but it sounded more like breaking glass than humor. I'm going to destroy it. No court is going to believe Chad would choose an absent father over the wife who stood by him. She spun toward the door, then turned back for one final attack. You want to know why Chad married me, Otis? Because I made him feel valuable in ways you never could. Because I understood success and ambition, not just fixing broken-down trucks. The blow hit its mark. I felt every year of distance between Chad and me, every missed visit, every phone call that ended too soon because we'd run out of things to say. I'm not letting this stand, Joyce declared, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd never lost a fight she really wanted to win. You'll see me in court. She stormed toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. At the threshold, she turned back one last time, her face a mask of fury and determination. This isn't over, old man. Not by a long shot. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The conference room fell into shocked silence, the only sound coming from Cecil's careful gathering of the scattered legal papers. Tyler cleared his throat nervously. I have a flight to catch. Within minutes, the office had emptied except for Cecil and me. I sat there staring at the scattered remains of Joyce's tantrum, wondering what my son had set in motion with his surprising final wishes. Through the windows, I could see the parking garage where Joyce was probably already making phone calls, mobilizing whatever forces she thought could overturn Chad's decision. The battle lines were drawn, and I was about to become the reluctant center of a war I'd never wanted to fight. Cecil straightened his tie and began reorganizing his documents. Mr. Fox, he said quietly, I think you should know, this might get complicated. 3 days after Joyce stormed out of Cecil's office, I sat in my motel room staring at legal papers I barely understood. The Desert Inn had become my reluctant home, its faded wallpaper and flickering neon sign a strange backdrop for decisions involving more money than I'd ever imagined. Cecil had explained the process in terms a mechanic could grasp. Joyce was challenging the will on grounds of undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated Chad during a vulnerable time. The accusation stung because it painted me as the kind of man I'd tried never to be. She's hired Richard Stone, Cecil had warned during our meeting that morning. He's aggressive, expensive, and specializes in will contests. This won't be easy. Stone's reputation preceded him like a bad smell. 3 decades of courtroom victories built on emotional manipulation and legal technicalities. If Joyce wanted a shark, she'd found the perfect predator. By the end of the first week, Harlan had flown in from Texas, his presence filling the cramped motel room with the comfort of old friendship. He'd aged since I'd seen him last. More gray, deeper lines around his eyes, but his handshake was still firm, his resolve unshaken. Joyce made a mistake hiring Stone, he said, unpacking his worn suitcase on the second bed. Juries don't like lawyers who try too hard to manipulate them. Meanwhile, across town, Joyce was writing checks she couldn't afford to Stone's law firm. I learned this later, but at the time I could only imagine her desperation driving her to gamble everything on overturning Chad's decision. Stone's strategy became clear through the legal motions Cecil showed me. Paint Chad as vulnerable, depressed, susceptible to his father's guilt-inducing visits. Make me look like a calculating manipulator who'd preyed on a sick son's emotions. The truth was simpler and more painful. Chad and I had grown apart over the years, our conversations becoming awkward exchanges of surface pleasantries. I hadn't visited more often before his death. Dee, if anything, I'd visited less, intimidated by his success and Joyce's obvious hostility. Cecil gathered our evidence methodically, medical records showing Chad's excellent mental health, right up until his heart attack, testimony from the notary who'd witnessed the will signing, confirming Chad's clear intentions, business records proving his sharp decision-making continued until the day he died. The will was executed properly, Cecil assured me during one of our strategy sessions. Chad was of sound mind, the document is legally valid, and there's no evidence of coercion. But Stone wasn't fighting the facts. He was crafting a story. During depositions, he painted pictures of an estranged father, suddenly showing interest when his son became wealthy. He twisted normal family dynamics into sinister manipulation. 3 weeks into our preparation, the court date arrived. May 20th, 2025. The official notice felt heavier than it should have, the legal language making everything seem more final than death itself. Harlan found me that evening sitting on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the court summons. "Justice will win tomorrow, friend," he said quietly. "Chad made his choice for reasons we may never fully understand, but it was his choice to make." I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me like hunger. Had I somehow influenced Chad without realizing it? Had my working-class values and barely concealed disapproval of his lifestyle pushed him toward this dramatic gesture? "Maybe Joyce is right," I said. "Maybe I don't deserve this inheritance." Harlan's response was swift and certain. "That boy saw something in you worth trusting with $29 million. Don't dishonor his memory by doubting his judgment." Outside, L.A. hummed with its endless energy, millions of people pursuing their dreams while I prepared to defend an inheritance I'd never wanted. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether Chad's final wishes would stand or crumble under Joyce's legal assault. The marble steps of Los Angeles County Superior Court felt colder than the cemetery where we'd buried Chad a month ago. Harlan walked beside me, his presence steady as bedrock, while across the plaza Joyce emerged from a black town car with Stone, both of them dressed for victory. Courtroom 312 smelled of old wood and decades of legal battles. Judge Williams, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, commanded the room with quiet authority. She'd reviewed the case files, Cecil had told me, and wasn't known for suffering fools. Stone wasted no time in his opening statement. "Your Honor, this case is about an elderly man who manipulated his vulnerable son during a period of depression and illness. Otis Fox preyed upon Chad Fox's guilt about their relationship to secure a massive inheritance he never earned or deserved." His voice carried the practiced rhythm of a preacher selling salvation, each word calculated for maximum emotional impact. Joyce sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, the picture of grieving widow denied her rightful inheritance. Cecil's response was measured, factual. Chad Fox was mentally competent when he executed this will 3 months before his death. He made a deliberate choice to provide for his father, and no evidence of undue influence exists beyond Ms. Fox's disappointment with her inheritance. Joyce took the stand first, her performance polished from weeks of preparation. She spoke of Chad's depression over their strained marriage, his guilt about disappointing his father, his vulnerable state in the months before his death. "He became obsessed with making amends," she testified, her voice breaking at strategic moments. "Otis would call, and Chad would be upset for days afterward. He felt like he'd failed as a son." Stone guided her through a narrative that transformed normal family dynamics into psychological manipulation. Every phone call became coercion. Every expression of paternal love became emotional blackmail. When my turn came, I felt every eye in the courtroom measuring me against Joyce's accusations. My hands shook as I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "Mr. Fox," Cecil began gently, "how often did you visit your son in the months before his death?" "Maybe 3 times in 2 years," I admitted. "We talked on the phone for holidays, birthdays, but I didn't visit much. Joyce made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Did you ever ask your son for money?" "Never." I didn't even know he had as much as he did. Stone's cross-examination was brutal, designed to rattle me into admissions that supported Joyce's narrative. But 68 years of life had taught me the value of simple honesty. "Isn't it true, Mr. Fox, that you resented your son's success?" I was proud of what Chad accomplished. Maybe I didn't understand his world, but I never resented it. "You disapproved of his marriage to Joyce, didn't you?" I paused, meeting Joyce's eyes across the courtroom. "I thought she married him for his money. Turns out I was right." The gallery stirred at my bluntness. Stone tried to paint it as evidence of my vindictive nature, but Judge Williams looked unmoved by his theatrics. The notary who'd witnessed Chad's will testified next, describing a man who seemed tired but determined. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she said. "Read every page, ask specific questions about the language. His instructions were very clear." Medical testimony confirmed Chad's mental competence. Business records showed sharp decision-making right up until his death. Phone records disproved Joyce's claims about frequent manipulation calls from me. By afternoon, Stone's case was crumbling under the weight of facts. His closing argument grew increasingly desperate, appealing to emotion where evidence had failed. Don't let a grieving widow be cheated out of her rightful inheritance by a man who abandoned his son for decades, then swooped in like a vulture when money was involved. Cecil's closing was simpler, more direct. Chad Fox made a choice. The evidence shows he was competent to make that choice. The court should honor his wishes, not overturn them based on speculation and disappointment. Judge Williams announced her recess with the gravity of someone about to change lives forever. "Given the complexity of this case, the court will review all evidence overnight. I will render my decision tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. As we filed out, Joyce caught my arm in the hallway. "This isn't over, old man," she hissed. "Even if you win, you'll never be worthy of what Chad built." Her words followed me to the parking garage, where Harlan and I sat in my truck, neither of us able to speak. Tomorrow morning, everything would change one way or another. Sleep had been impossible. I sat in the motel parking lot at dawn, watching the sunrise paint the LA skyline gold, wondering if this was my last morning as a poor man or my first as someone who'd stolen what wasn't rightfully his. Harlan emerged from the room carrying 2 cups of coffee, his face showing the same sleepless night I'd endured. "Whatever happens today," he said, settling beside me on the truck's tailgate, "you've conducted yourself with honor." The drive back to court passed in silence, heavy with anticipation. Joyce and Stone were already there, huddled in intense conversation near the courthouse steps. She looked older somehow, the strain of the past month visible in lines that expensive makeup couldn't quite hide. Courtroom 312 felt different this morning, charged with the electricity of impending judgment. Judge Williams entered with the measured pace of someone carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom, her decision already rendered in private chambers. "After careful review of all evidence and testimony presented," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "this court finds the will of Chad Michael Fox to be legally valid and executed with full mental competency." Joyce's sharp intake of breath cut through the formal atmosphere like breaking glass. Stone's face remained professionally neutral, but I caught him calculating appeal options behind his practiced composure. "The testator clearly intended to leave his estate to his father," Judge Williams continued, "and no credible evidence of undue influence has been presented. The disappointed expectations of an heir do not constitute grounds for overturning a properly executed will." Her gavel fell with finality that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. "The will stands as written. Case dismissed." In the hallway afterward, Joyce cornered me one last time, her composure finally cracking completely. "This isn't over, old man. I'll appeal this travesty." "Joyce," I said calmly, surprising myself with my steadiness, "Chad made his choice. Maybe it's time to accept it and move on with your life. He never would have chosen you over me if you hadn't poisoned him against his own wife." Her voice carried the shrillness of complete defeat. "Maybe he saw something. I'm only beginning to understand," I replied, the words coming from some place I hadn't known existed. She stormed away, Stone trailing behind her with the resigned air of a lawyer already mentally preparing his bill for services rendered. Their war was over, but I suspected Joyce would never truly surrender. At LAX, Harlan's departure gate felt like the end of an era. We'd been through something together that had tested the foundations of our 40-year friendship and found them solid as bedrock. "Justice won today, friend," he said, gripping my shoulder with weathered hands. "Chad would be proud of how you handled yourself." "I still don't understand why he did this," I admitted. $29 million to a man who barely visited, barely called. Harlan's smile carried wisdom earned through decades of watching human nature play out in courtrooms and living rooms. "Maybe that boy saw what I've always seen D, a man worth trusting with anything, including the responsibility of wealth." The drive home to Texas stretched endless before me, 12 hours to process what my life had become. Somewhere around the New Mexico border, understanding began to dawn like sunrise after the longest night. Chad hadn't left me money because I'd manipulated him. He'd left it because I hadn't. In a world full of Joyce's D people who saw him as a bank account with a heartbeat D, I'd remained the father who loved him for the boy he'd been, not the fortune he'd built. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was validation, protection for my old age, and proof that despite our distance, the love between father and son had survived everything Joyce's world could throw at it. Back in my garage 3 days later, I found myself staring at that same photograph of 8-year-old Chad holding his prize base. But now I saw something I'd missed before D, not just a proud boy with his catch, but the foundation of a man who'd grown up knowing he was loved unconditionally. "Thank you, boy," I whispered to the photo, my voice thick with understanding that had come almost too late. "I finally get what you were trying to tell me." Outside, Texas stretched under an endless sky, and for the first time in months, the future felt full of possibility instead of loss. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.